Number 6. Jaroslav Hanel. In January of 2020, officers and firefighters arrived at a home at the far end of the famed Waikiki Beach to a crime scene that grew progressively more chaotic. 69-year-old Jaroslav Hanel, originally from the Czech Republic, reacted with extreme violence upon learning that plans to evict him were finally set in motion. For years, Hanel had been living for free at a property owned by 77-year-old Lois Kane in an upscale neighborhood on Hibiscus Road. In exchange for his work as a handyman, neighbors described him as paranoid and unhinged. He would allegedly harass visitors, chase cars down the street, rig barbecues to blow thick smoke into their windows, and film them with a GoPro mounted on his hat. He repeatedly refused to leave the property, even though several neighbors had had restraining orders against him since 2014. It's believed that Hanel sought revenge after his eviction notice was handed down. His rampage began on January the 19th with the killing of Kane. Gisela King, a tenant in the same home, went to find the landlady. Hanel was in the laundry room but wouldn't let King inside. She then heard a sound which she'd later identify as Kane gasping for air. King tried to call the police, but Hanel charged her and started stabbing her with a gardening tool. He kept attacking the woman as she curled into a ball and pleaded for her life. Neighbors managed to chase him away, pulled King up the driveway, and improvised a tourniquet for her severely wounded leg. As police arrived at the address and walked towards the entrance, Hanel opened fire on them with an AR-15 rifle. Officers Tiffany Enriquez, age 38, and 34-year-old Kulaike Kalama sustained fatal gunshot injuries. Both had reportedly been wearing bulletproof vests but were struck above them. Hanel then set the home ablaze and more gunshot sounds were heard, attributed to Hanel's spare ammunition that caught fire inside. Firefighters were initially asked to keep their distance so that they wouldn't be struck by stray rounds. The fire extended and gutted at least 7 homes while damaging several others. The remains of Hanel and Kane were recovered from the ashes and positively identified. Honolulu Police Chief Susan Ballard held back tears as she announced the death of the 2 officers whom she said were like her kids, while King mourned the passing of Kane, whom she regarded as a mother figure. Number 5. Lindani Myeni. A former rugby player and Idols contestant from South Africa was fatally shot by Honolulu police officers in April of 2021 following an alleged burglary. A 911 call provided some insight into the incident that ended in the death of Lindani Myeni, reported as a prince from the Zulu kingdom. He entered an Airbnb rented by Cheyenne Sabine Wang and her husband. The woman called the police claiming that an intruder was inside. As confirmed by the caller, Myeni had already left the home when officers arrived at the scene. It was after 8 p.m. and in the dark, a physical struggle ensued between 29-year-old Myeni and the officers, which resulted in them shooting him dead. 2 versions of events emerged in the aftermath. It was reported that Myeni had failed to comply after being ordered to get on the ground and that he attacked the officers. They reportedly tried to use non-lethal means of incapacitating the former professional athlete, including a taser, all of which proved ineffective. Fearing for their lives, they then fired their service weapons. Myeni was taken to the Queen's Medical Center where he passed away from multiple gunshot injuries. All 3 officers were hurt, and one of them had to be treated for a concussion. The official version of events was challenged in a wrongful death lawsuit filed by Myeni's widow, Lindsay, originally from Oahu. She, Myeni, and their 2 children had recently moved to Hawaii. According to the suit, Myeni had thought he was visiting a temple which was next door to the property and left when becoming aware his presence in the home was unwanted. The suit claimed that Myeni had been treated as less than a human being and, as an unarmed black man, had been racially discriminated by the renters and the arresting officers. Myeni had asked, "Who are you?" as a flashlight shone into his eyes and a weapon was pointed at him prior to attacking the officers. Bodycam footage indicated that they'd only announced themselves as the police after 4 shots had already rung out. Footage from a doorbell surveillance camera seemingly confirmed that Myeni had mistakenly thought he was visiting a temple, as he left and repeatedly apologized to the couple. The homeowner reported that the property had been misidentified as such in the past. Myeni was also wearing his ukulele, a traditional ceremonial Zulu headband, in homage to the spiritual place he thought he was entering. None of the officers were charged in the incident, and it's unclear if the matter would be reinvestigated. For their part, the Wangs reported that Myeni had followed them into the home and filmed them, claiming to be the homeowner, before rummaging through their bedrooms. Police wouldn't confirm if it was the same story they'd shared when detectives first interviewed them. Number 4. Jill Hansen. In May of 2014, a surfer was taken to jail with bail set at $1 million on attempted murder charges after hitting an elderly woman with her car. 73-year-old Elizabeth Conklin had no memory of the incident as she woke up in an ambulance. She was taken to a Honolulu hospital with 2 black eyes and various internal injuries, but her condition was stable. The incident occurred at the Diamond Head Apartments in Waikiki. 30-year-old surfer Jill Hansen, who also modeled her own line of wetsuits, had waited until Conklin exited her vehicle and then rammed her own car into her. As the victim was lying on the ground, Hansen geared up for a second strike, but was stopped by a maintenance worker who knocked on her rear window, potentially stopping her from ending the elderly woman's life. While initially reported as a road rage incident, prosecutors would argue that Hansen had run Conklin over because she was driving a BMW, described as her dream car. She jumped in and tried to drive it away, but ultimately fled the scene by flagging down a passing motorist. Hansen was tracked down and arrested. Roughly a year after the incident, she was found not guilty by reason of insanity. Multiple clinicians determined that she wasn't in control of her actions at the time, having previously stated that voices in her head had told her to run Conklin over. Number 3. Honolulu plane crash. On July the 28th of 2017, a small plane crashed in a remote mountainous region of Oahu 15 minutes after takeoff, killing its 4 occupants. They were identified as Virginia woman Heather Riley and her boyfriend Garrett Evanson, both in their late 20s, along with Texas woman Alexis Aaron and pilot Dean Hutton, aged 32 and 29 respectively. Traffic control operators lost communication with the Beech 19A fixed-wing single-engine aircraft shortly after it had departed from Honolulu Airport. It was determined that it had crashed into the mountainside shortly before 7 p.m. The wreckage and bodies were discovered the following day in the Waianae Mountains above Kunia. An investigation by the National Transportation Safety Board attributed the crash to pilot error and found no mechanical issues with the aircraft. It's been reported that after performing several 360-degree loops, Hutton was flying at a low altitude and too close to the mountain. A witness had reported seeing the low-flying aircraft attempt to make a turn and then hearing a boom after it had gone out of view. Number 2. Xerox Massacre. The worst mass murder in the history of Hawaii occurred on November the 2nd of 1999 at a Xerox Corporation building in Honolulu. Service technician Brian Koji Uyesugi entered his workplace armed with a Glock 17 handgun and extra ammunition. Shortly after graduating high school in the late 1970s, Uyesugi had crashed his father's car and sustained an injury from smashing his head on the windshield. According to his brother, he wasn't the same afterwards. After he'd started working for Xerox, his colleagues described him as difficult. He made unfounded accusations towards those in his work group of harassment, backstabbing behavior, and the spreading of rumors which ultimately caused them to avoid him. Uyesugi threatened his colleagues' lives and openly talked about carrying out a mass shooting at the building should he ever be let go. Then, management began to gradually replace the photocopier that he serviced, and Uyesugi resisted learning the new machine, but on November the 1st, his manager insisted he begin training. Believing he was on the verge of getting fired, Uyesugi entered the building the following day armed with the Glock. After a brief chat with an employee, he went to the second floor, where he gunned down employees Ron Kawame and Jason Balatico in one of the offices. He then entered a conference room, where a meeting was taking place. He waved goodbye at the 5 workers inside, including his supervisor, then executed them. The shooter's rampage resulted in the death of 7 colleagues with ages between 33 and 58. Uyasugi fled in a company van and was arrested near the Hawaii Nature Center in Makiki after a 5-hour standoff with the police. In the aftermath, the police revealed he had 25 firearms registered in his name. During his trial, doctors determined that he fulfilled the criteria for schizophrenia, but he was deemed competent to stand trial. Hawaii doesn't have the death penalty, and in 2000, the Honolulu-born killer was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 235 years served, the longest sentence ever ordered for a Hawaii inmate. Legislation was passed at state level in the massacre's wake that required doctors to reveal the mental state of people looking to buy guns. Number 1. Honolulu Strangler. The Honolulu Strangler, Hawaii's first known serial killer, terrorized the paradisiacal city in the mid-1980s but was never brought to justice. Active between 1985 and 1986, the Strangler was responsible for the death of at least 5 women. The first victim was 25-year-old Vicky Gale Purdy, the wife of an Army helicopter pilot, who was supposed to meet her friends and go clubbing in Waikiki on May the 29th of 1985. She was last seen alive at around 12 a.m. by the taxi driver who'd driven her back to her car. Purdy's lifeless body was found the following morning in an embankment at Kihei Lagoon. Her hands were bound behind her back and she'd been abused and strangled to death. The following 2 victims were Regina Sakamoto and Denise Hughes, who were killed following the same modus operandi in January of 1986. On February the 5th, a serial killer task force was put together in collaboration with the FBI and the Green River Killer Task Force. The Honolulu Strangler was determined to be an opportunistic killer who didn't stalk his victims, but instead preyed on vulnerable women when they were alone at bus stops or other locations. Evidence suggested that to avoid detection, he carried out his crimes in the back of a light-colored van. 2 more killings followed. 25-year-old Louise Medeiros disappeared after she had told her family she would return by bus from the airport on March the 26th. Road workers found her decomposing body unclothed in the lower half and with the hands bound behind her back near Waikele Stream in early April. The Strangler's last known victim was 36-year-old Linda Pesce. She was reported missing by her roommate after she'd failed to return home from work on April the 29th. In the aftermath of her disappearance, a man named Howard Gay approached the police, claiming that a psychic had told him where to find Pesce's body. He'd led them to an exact location on Sand Island, and while the body wasn't there, it was eventually recovered elsewhere on the island. Gay was arrested and became the police's most prominent suspect. 2 of his former partners had revealed that he partook in bondage, a potentially incriminating fetish considering the nature of the crimes. He also fit the suspected build and age of the killer. Gay was interrogated for hours and took a polygraph test, which came back inconclusive. However, much of the evidence that the authorities had to tie him to the killings was deemed circumstantial. He became a free man and stated, "The police have released me. That's all I know. They have plenty of good cause. They're doing their job." The killings stopped following his arrest and release. Gay died of kidney failure in 2003. Several leading members of the task force believed that had DNA testing been available at the time, he would have been confirmed as the Honolulu Strangler. Number 9. Robert Benjamin Smith. In November of 1966, Robert Benjamin Smith, aged 18, entered the Rosemar College of Beauty in Mesa, Arizona. Smith was obsessed with famous leaders including Hitler, Caesar, and Napoleon. He was desperate for fame and recognition after seeing the amount of media coverage that 2 other US shootings had that year. He ordered everyone inside the college to get on the floor, but one woman was able to run to a store nearby and alert the police. Smith proceeded to kill 4 women, as well as a small child. He didn't know any of his victims. He had planned the killing spree for over 3 months. Smith was eventually apprehended and arrested, and showed no remorse for what he'd done. He even claimed that he had planned to kill 40 people so that he could make a name for himself. According to Smith, no one had ever paid attention to him, and he wanted to change that. Originally, Smith received the death sentence, but after a Supreme Court ruling on the death penalty, his sentence was later commuted to life in prison. Number 8. The murders of the Flores-Gonzalez household. On May the 30th of 2009, Gina Gonzalez, along with her husband, Raul Jr. Flores, and their daughter, Brisenia, were sleeping soundly in their home. There was a knock at the door, to which Flores answered. Standing at the door were a woman and two men. They claimed to be law enforcement and said that they needed to search the house for illegal immigrants. Flores asked why they were there, but he was shot dead by one of the men. Gina and Brasinia were then also shot, with only Gina surviving her bullet wound. She played dead until the killers left and afterwards called 911. The group then returned, finding her on the phone. Gina was able to grab a gun and fire it towards the group, causing them to flee the scene. It was later claimed that the group was attempting to raise money for an anti-immigrant organization, and they suspected the family were drug smugglers. Shauna Ford, the mastermind behind the attack, orchestrated much of the organization's efforts. Upon their conviction, Ford was sentenced to death for the murders, whilst her accomplices received 2 life sentences and death. Number 7. Dwight Lamont Jones. Dwight Lamont Jones was a mentally ill man suffering from personality disorders and paranoia. He was bitter about his 2010 divorce from Connie Jones, to whom he'd been married for 20 years. 8 years after the divorce, in 2018, he began a killing spree, targeting everyone that had been involved. The murder started on the 31st of May with the forensic psychiatrist who had diagnosed his mental illness and testified against him in court. Jones then went after his ex-wife's lawyer, but ended up murdering 2 paralegals. 2 days later, Marshall, a 72-year-old life coach and hypnotherapist, was also killed. His actual target was a doctor in the same practice, but Jones discovered the doctor had moved to another office and chose to kill the therapist instead. Connie Jones and her new partner, a retired police officer called Richard Anglin, saw the killings reported in the media and immediately made the connection to Dwight Jones. They informed the police of their suspicion, and a manhunt was immediately launched. While this was happening, Jones killed an elderly couple he used to play tennis with, Byron Thomas and Mary Simmons, both in their early 70s. The police tracked Jones down to a hotel in anticipation of a potential shootout. Number 6. Jason Derrick Brown. Jason Derrick Brown, an FBI top 10 most wanted fugitive, was known as an arrogant playboy with a taste for expensive toys and lavish parties. In November of 2004, he murdered armored car guard Robert Palomares in a movie theater heist. Palomares was shot 5 times, with one of the bullets fatally penetrating his brain. Brown made off on a bicycle with over $50,000 in cash. Fingerprints found at the scene later revealed Brown as the main suspect, as he'd bought a .45 caliber pistol earlier that year and had his fingerprints taken while doing so. Police believe that Brown escaped Arizona in his BMW and that his brother may have helped him to do so. He faces charges of first-degree murder and armed robbery and has so far evaded arrest. The FBI has offered a $200,000 reward for information leading to his capture. Number 5. Gary Triana and Pam Phillips. Gary Triana and Pam Phillips formed a well-presented couple in Tucson, Arizona. Both regarded as members of high society, they often mingled with the likes of Donald Trump and his wife at the time. Triana and Phillips had married in 1986 and had 2 children together. Their life together seemed perfect. The marriage, however, came under pressure 7 years later, when Triana's gambling debts began to threaten the financial stability of the family. It eventually led to their divorce in 1993. 13 years later, in November of 2006, Triana was getting into his car after playing golf with a friend when a pipe bomb exploded, killing him. Triana was known to do business with members of organized crime, so many thought it had been a contract assassination, but investigators found the bomb to be poorly constructed and ruled out mafia involvement. A few weeks after Triana's death, Pam Phillips came out of the shadows to claim his life insurance policy, which stood at $2 million. This prompted an investigation into Phillips. After looking into previous financial records, law enforcement found that over time, Phillips had paid $40,000 to her new partner, Ronald Young. Investigators then started searching abandoned vehicles, eventually coming by one that had previously been rented by Young. Inside the vehicle, investigators found extensive information related to Triana, such as lists of his known associates, maps, receipts from hotels Triana had stayed at, as well as documents related to Phillips and Triana's divorce. It was enough evidence to charge both Young and Phillips for Triana's murder. The woman's plan had reportedly been set in motion for more than a decade. She and her partner were found guilty and imprisoned. Number 4. Business dispute kills family. Driss Dyer Edin was the middle brother between his senior brother Dodi and his younger brother Reda. They worked together operating their own limousine business in Phoenix. Acquaintances described the brothers as hard workers. Driss, however, was known to have a temper. On Friday, April the 17th of 2015, the extent of his instability came to light in a horrific way. Acquaintances of the family said that the brothers were having an ongoing business dispute, which eventually sent Driss into a rage. He acquired a semi-automatic handgun and shot both of his brothers, one of their wives, and his own mother. Driss's wife, his 2 children, and his sister managed to escape the massacre. Authorities were alerted to the gunfire. Police arrived at the house prepared for a shootout and used a megaphone to attempt communication with those inside. When officers eventually moved in to assess the situation, they found nothing but a slain family. Number 3. William Craig Miller. William Craig Miller was involved in an arson for hire case, burning down his own house in Scottsdale so that he could claim insurance. Miller owned a home restoration company and enlisted the assistance of his employee, Stephen Duffy, in the arson plot. Weeks later, Duffy's girlfriend contacted the authorities telling them what Miller and Duffy had done. The latter agreed to cooperate with law enforcement as they investigated Miller. Both Duffy and his girlfriend were set to testify against him. This enraged Miller, and he went on a killing spree to eliminate those working against him in the arson and fraud case. Miller shot Duffy and his girlfriend dead, as well as 3 other family members in their Mesa home. Miller escaped the house where he'd executed his victims before the authorities arrived to reports of gunshots. 1 week later, he staged and reported a burglary at his own house. It was an attempt to mislead the police into thinking that whoever had killed Duffy's family was after him too. It failed, however, when investigators retrieved items at the house which linked Miller to the murders. During the trial, 4 men came forward testifying that Miller had attempted to enlist each of them as assassins. When that failed, Miller took it upon himself to kill the family. He was convicted of first-degree murder in all cases and sentenced to death a month later. Number 2. The Yarnell Hill Fire. The Yarnell Hill Fire was a devastating natural disaster that ripped through 8,400 acres of land in 2011. Started by lightning, the fire spread rapidly due to a drought that the area was experiencing. Another factor which further increased its power and intensity were natural air temperatures of up to 101 degrees Fahrenheit. At one point, 600 firefighters were deployed in the battle against the blaze. The town of Yarnell was evacuated as a precaution. The fire caused widespread destruction, but the deadliest incident that emerged from it was the death of 19 firefighters, part of a 20-man crew known as the Granite Mountain Hotshots. Brendan McDonough, a lookout for the team, was the sole survivor, having been told by the second-in-command to abandon his post and evacuate. The fire, which was already erratic due to rapidly changing wind conditions, had reportedly trapped the firefighters and obstructed their situational awareness. The Hotshots put down fire shelters in an attempt to shield themselves from the heat. But it wasn't enough. Where the firefighters perished, the wildfire had soared to over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. After the conflagration was contained and the bodies were recovered, the state of Arizona mourned, flying flags at half-mast in honor of the firefighters, who had also been the only casualties. Barack Obama, who was president at the time, publicly praised their heroic sacrifices. Number 1. Buddhist temple murders. Considered the worst massacre in Arizona's recent history, the Waddle Buddhist temple shooting took place on August 9th of 1991. Near Phoenix, on that day, 17-year-old Jonathan Doody and his accomplice, 16-year-old Alessandro Garcia, entered a Buddhist temple armed with guns. They robbed the monks inside of roughly $2,600. According to Garcia, Doody then panicked, thinking one of the monks might have recognized him. Duty then, in an execution-like manner, proceeded to shoot all 9 occupants of the temple in the head. Garcia later stated that it had always been the plan not to leave any witnesses behind. Both Duty and Garcia were charged with armed robbery and first-degree murder. They were convicted 3 years after the massacre, and both received several life sentences for their crimes. Number 8. The Circus Circus Casino Heist. In 1993, the Circus Circus Casino in Las Vegas was robbed of $2.95 million. Heather Tallchief and her accomplice, Roberto Solis, disappeared from the scene in an armored truck. Over 10 years later, in 2005, Tallchief turned herself in to the Las Vegas authorities. She was sentenced to 5 years and 3 months for her role in the robbery. Solis, a criminal with an extensive history in robbery, was never found, and none of the stolen money has ever been recovered. Number 7. Esmeralda Gonzalez. On May the 31st of 2019, Esmeralda Gonzalez, a Vegas glamour model, was reported missing by her family. Her remains were found 5 months later encased in a homemade concrete structure in the desert. 24-year-old Esmeralda was reported to have mental problems, and it's believed she'd mistakenly entered the home of her killers, thinking it was her own. She had recently stopped taking her medication, according to her brother, Christopher Prestipino, 45, and his girlfriend, 31-year-old Lisa Mort, were the occupants of the house. After coaxing her with illegal substances, they tied her to a bed, at which point Esmeralda began to experience a mental breakdown. She threatened to call the police on the deranged couple, which led to Prestipino strangling her to death. She was then injected with poisonous pool cleaner, which investigators believe had been a measure taken to ensure she was dead. Prestipino proceeded to dump Esmeralda's body in the Las Vegas desert, where he encased her with concrete. An investigation was opened into Esmeralda's disappearance, and the tip was given to the police by a friend of Prestipino's. The friend allegedly claimed that Prestipino had told him that he'd killed the missing girl. Prestipino was arrested along with his girlfriend, Mort. He was put on trial and originally faced charges of murder, first-degree kidnapping, and murder conspiracy. However, he was later committed to a mental psychiatry hospital after undergoing professional examination. Mort's charge was listed as conceal and aiding an offender. She later confessed guilty to accessory to murder. Number 6. Murder of Melissa James. In December of 2005, a motorist stumbled upon a Jaguar in the middle of the desert. It had been torched, and inside the trunk of the vehicle was the body of 28-year-old Melissa James. Melissa had moved to Vegas only 4 months earlier, having been coerced by her employer, Craig Titus. Craig and his wife, Kelly Ryan, were fitness industry superstars. Between them, they held multiple bodybuilding titles. Melissa had been employed by the couple as a live-in personal assistant, and although Craig and Kelly denied any involvement in her death, mounting evidence loomed against them. The autopsy revealed Melissa had been strangled, shot with a taser, and injected with a lethal dose of morphine prior to her death. Craig and Kelly were eventually arrested on suspicion of the murder, and in 2008, they pled guilty to it. They are currently serving their time in prisons in Nevada. Number 5. The murder of Tupac Shakur. Tupac Shakur was a 25-year-old hip-hop artist from the West Coast. He was murdered in Las Vegas on September the 7th of 1996 in what is thought to have been an organized hit. Tupac was a passenger in a car driven by Suge Knight, the founder of Death Row Records. While stopped at a red light, a white four-door Cadillac appeared and drove up to his vehicle. Gunmen inside the Cadillac opened fire on Tupac, and he was hit by 4 bullets. 2 penetrated his chest, 1 went into his arm, and another into his thigh. Tupac was rushed to the hospital, having initially survived his injuries, but 6 days later died of cardiac arrest. To this day, the murder of Tupac Shakur remains unsolved, and this has prompted many theories from his devastated fans and the hip-hop community. Some of them propose the hit had been ordered by Suge Knight himself, rival music groups from the East Coast, or even that Tupac had staged his death and is in fact still alive. Number 4. Pipe bombing at the Luxor. The Luxor, a luxury hotel and casino in Vegas, was hit by a pipe bomb attack on May the 7th of 2007. The pipe bomb was sophisticated, having been disguised as a coffee cup. It was placed in the parking garage on top of 24-year-old Wilibaldo Antonio's car. Equipped with a motion trigger, as Antonio went to his vehicle, it blew up, killing him. The creator of the bomb had allegedly built it for his friend. who was jealous that Antonio was dating his former girlfriend. The two suspects were arrested and sentenced to life with the possibility of parole. Number 3. Arson at the Las Vegas Hilton. In 1981, a 23-year-old busboy at the Hilton Hotel in Las Vegas made headlines as he started a fire in the elevator lobby. Philip Klein, described as a troubled young man, was initially thought to have tried to put the fire out, but it was later determined he'd intentionally started the blaze. The fire spread through the hotel fast and trapped guests in their rooms. Over 200 people were injured and 8 people died. Klein was convicted of the 8 counts of murder and confessed to the arson in a jail interview. He said that he'd purposefully used the lighter to set fire to some curtains. Number 2. Tony Carlio. One morning in December of 2010, Tony Carlio, who'd become known as the Biker Bandit, set his sights on the Bellagio Hotel and Casino. 5 days prior, Tony had successfully robbed another casino, the Suncoast. He'd held up the poker room and had made it out with $19,000 in cash. It was his first casino robbery, and he intended to carry forward the momentum he had built. Wearing dark overalls, gloves, and a motorcycle helmet, Tony walked towards the Bellagio with a gun hidden in his right pocket. He casually exchanged waves with an elderly security guard as he walked through the entrance. Although the casino was quiet in the early hours, he knew his presence would quickly raise the alarm. Tony went straight for a high-limit craps table and pulled out his gun. In front of him lay chips worth millions of dollars. Tony threw handfuls of chips into a backpack as fast as he could before he fled from the casino to his motorcycle outside. Speeding away from the crime scene, Tony has successfully made off with $1.5 million in his backpack. Tony returned to the casino regularly to convert his stolen chips into cash he could use. Posing as a regular player, he would sneak the stolen chips into his stack at the games he joined. The first time he did this was the day after the robbery, and at one point, he even joined the same craps table that he had robbed. He cashed out successfully multiple times. With his newfound fortune, Tony began to live the high life, indulging in everything Vegas had to offer. Meanwhile, detectives looking into the high-profile case were coming up with no leads. That was until Tony was flagged by the Bellagio's computer systems. Over $1 million of the chips Tony had stolen were $25 chips, known as cranberries due to their color. Players capable of holding these chips have a history of playing the highest of stakes at the casino, and the Bellagio have digital records of these high rollers. On these records, the name Tony Carlio was nowhere to be found. This drew suspicions from the casino, and Tony's name was passed over to the police investigation. However, even with this information, the authorities still didn't have any evidence that Tony had committed the heist. That was until Tony's greed got the better of him. He had begun posting on a poker forum online in an attempt to find local players who would pay him smaller denomination chips for his cranberries. He provided one user of the forum proof that he held the cranberries he claimed to have, and out of pride, supplied evidence that he was the infamous Biker Bandit. The user forwarded this information to the authorities. Now, evidence was beginning to stack up against Tony. An undercover police officer working on the investigation soon befriended him, and the two worked out deals for Tony's chips. Then, one day after the cash had exchanged hands, the undercover officer walked off without a word. 6 police officers appeared, surprising Tony and giving him no opportunity for escape. They forced him to the ground and handcuffed him. Just 7 weeks after pulling off the heist, Tony was arrested and paraded out the doors of the Bellagio. He was sentenced to 9 years in prison for his crimes. He reportedly regrets not being able to pull the heist off just as much as he regrets committing it in the first place. Number 1. Murder of Ted Binion. Ted Binion was a high-rolling gambling executive. His father, Benny Binion, was a casino business magnate and a well-known personality in Vegas. In 1998, Ted was found dead in his Las Vegas home. An autopsy revealed a cocktail of drugs, both prescription and illegal, in Ted's system. Initially thought to be an accidental suicide due to Ted's known addictions, detectives reclassified his death as homicide 6 months later, believing that it had been staged. In June of 1999, Ted's former girlfriend, along with her lover at the time, were arrested on suspicion of murder. The couple was also charged with robbery, grand larceny, and burglary, due to Ted's vault having been emptied. However, 4 years later, in 2003, their convictions were overturned by the Supreme Court. The court ruled that the judge had erred in his instructions to the jury during the couple's original trial. They were retried in 2004 when they were both acquitted of murder and instead were convicted on lesser charges. The couple has since been released from prison. Number 8. Victor Cuevas. In 2017, Victor Cuevas was accused of fatally shooting a man outside the Bellaterra shopping mall in Richmond. He was subsequently released on a $125,000 bond, but in May of 2021, Cuevas once again found himself in front of a judge. This time it was because his pet Bengal tiger, India, was spotted prowling through a Houston neighborhood. The tiger came face to face with an off-duty Waller County deputy before being pulled away by his owner. As the police arrived at the scene, Cuevas evaded arrest and fled with the 175-pound beast in the back of his SUV. While it's legal to own a tiger in Texas, it can't be held within city limits. Cuevas was arrested, but India remained missing for roughly 8 days. There was significant concern from the public that a tiger was on the loose in Houston. After moving India through various safe houses, Cuevas' wife, Gia, eventually turned him into Houston PD. The tiger was relocated to a wildlife sanctuary in Murchison. Cuevas' initial bond was revoked and a new one was set at $300,000, which he also paid and was once again released from custody pending a trial. Number 7. Alan Bard. In 2019, a Corpus Christi man led the authorities on an unconventional chase as he tried to evade capture in his tractor. 45-year-old Alan Bard had rear-ended a vehicle and then got into a confrontation with the driver. When the police arrived at the scene, an officer approached Bard with the intention of bringing him into custody. It was at that moment that Bard drove off in his John Deere tractor, dragging the officer with him. It was later reported that the officer had sustained injuries to his shoulder. Bard then engaged the police in an hour-long chase. 2 4x4 squad cars trailed him into a field. Another officer then cut off the tractor and held Bard at gunpoint, effectively putting an end to the pursuit. He was removed from the vehicle and detained on charges of evading arrest and aggravated assault of a police officer. Number 6. Brenda Delgado. In 2019, Brenda Delgado was sentenced to life in prison for masterminding the murder of Kendra Hatcher out of jealous rage. In 2015, Delgado's boyfriend, Ricardo Paniagua, ended their relationship after the pair had been seeing each other on and off for several years. Paniagua felt that they'd left things on a positive note, but had no idea of the obsession Delgado harbored towards him. The 33-year-old tracked his whereabouts via the GPS in his phone and routinely monitored his emails and messages. A few months after the breakup, Paniagua met pediatric dentist Kendra Hatcher on an online dating site. Upon learning that Paniagua had flown his new girlfriend out to San Francisco to meet his parents, Delgado's jealousy reached a boiling point, and she made the decision to kill her perceived rival. She enlisted accomplices 27-year-old Crystal Cortez and Christopher Love, aged 35. Delgado promised them money and drugs through unsubstantiated claims that she had cartel connections. Love acted as the triggerman and Cortez was meant to be the getaway driver. Delgado had told them to cover their tracks by making the killing look like a robbery. On September the 2nd of 2015, Love fatally shot Hatcher in the back of the head in the parking lot of her Dallas apartment complex. A few weeks later, the accomplices were arrested, but by that point, Delgado had fled to Mexico where she had citizenship. She was placed on the FBI's most wanted list with a $100,000 reward for information leading to her capture. After a few months spent in hiding, she was arrested in Mexico and extradited to the US on the condition that capital punishment won't be pursued. Cortez, who testified against the other two, was sentenced to 35 years with parole, while Love was sentenced to death via lethal injection. Number 5. Samantha Lopez. In late May of 2021, a woman was gunned down in San Antonio in front of her young children. At around 7 a.m., Samantha Lopez was getting her daughters ready for school outside MC Belden Apartments. The attacker approached 28-year-old Lopez and shot her once from behind and then again as she lay on the ground. The children, aged 2, 6, and 10, are believed to have witnessed the murder but were unharmed. An unnamed man identified as the woman's estranged husband was brought in for questioning. Lopez had had a protective order against him, and he'd been arrested multiple times for violating it. According to a preliminary investigation, the estranged husband was the main suspect in the shooting, but he hasn't been officially charged at this point in time. Number 4. Charles Albright. Charles Albright was one of the most terrifying serial killers to operate in the state of Texas, also known as the Eyeball Killer. He was arrested for one murder in 1991, but is strongly suspected to have committed at least another 2. In December of 1990, Mary Lou Pratt, a well-known prostitute in Dallas's Oak Cliff neighborhood, was found dead, only clothed in a bra and t-shirt. 33-year-old Pratt had been badly beaten and then shot in the head. A coroner stated that the killer had taken both her eyes after removing them with surgical precision. In February of the following year, 27-year-old Susan Beth Peterson, who was also a prostitute, was found on the same street as Pratt. She'd been shot in her left breast as well as in the back and through the top of her head. The killer had removed both her eyes. In March, the nude body of Shirley Williams was found propped up against a curb near an elementary school. When a medical field agent pulled back her eyelids, he realized her eyes were missing. Like the previous 2, she'd been beaten and shot in the head. The authorities were only able to concretely connect Albright to Williams's murder through hair found at the scene that matched his, as the rest of the evidence was deemed circumstantial. Albright was imprisoned at a psychiatric unit in Lubbock, where he died in 2020. Number 3. Murder of Adrian Wells. In 2019, a young man was killed in Dallas in a robbery gone awry. The day after 18-year-old Sydney Whitaker had first met Adrian Wells, aged 21, she called him to meet at his apartment, promising intimate relations. Wells was lured outside, at which point 3 armed robbers forced him back into the apartment, demanding cash. The intruders opened fire upon discovering there were other people at the residence. Wells was fatally shot while a 45-year-old man, whose identity wasn't released, was critically wounded. A witness would report that after hearing the gunshots, he saw Whitaker, who bore a distinctive facial tattoo, running from the area. When asked if she was all right, the teenager replied, no. She then called the police saying that she had information about Wells's murder but didn't show up at the station after agreeing to an interview. She was eventually arrested and charged with capital murder along with Tyrone Williams and Jeroy Rogers, both in their early 20s. Number 2. Genesis Corneo Alvarado. The murder of Genesis Corneo Alvarado is among the most brutal to have occurred in Texas in recent years. On February the 16th of 2017, the body of a teenager who'd been shot twice at close range was found on Sharpcrest Street in southwest Houston. In March, the body was identified as that of Corneo, who had been reported missing about a month prior. The 15-year-old and another teenager had been kidnapped and held captive by Miguel Alvarez Flores and Diego Hernandez Rivera. The illegal immigrants from El Salvador were self-described Satanists and members of the MS-13 gang. After kidnapping Corneo, they gave her drugs and abused her for a month. The other teenage victim went through the same ordeal and was also forcibly tattooed by Alvarez. She was able to escape and led the authorities back to the men while also giving an account of the circumstances surrounding Corneo's murder. She'd reportedly been killed for criticizing a satanic statue nicknamed the Beast, which was at the apartment. Alvarez took offense and, after offering the shrine a cigarette, claimed that it wanted a soul instead. Hernandez confessed to the killing after the pair was arrested. They were each sentenced to 40 years for murder and aggravated kidnapping. During their arraignment, they caused public outcry as they laughed and waved at the cameras. Number 1. Sutherland Springs church shooting. On November the 5th of 2017, Devin Patrick Kelly parked his Ford Explorer SUV in the front of the First Baptist Church in Sutherland Springs and emerged armed with a Ruger AR-556 semi-automatic rifle. Kelly, who was wearing a bulletproof vest and a black face mask with a white skull on it, gunned down 2 people in front of the church. He continued firing on the building where people were attending Sunday service and then entered shouting, "Everybody dies." Kelly walked up and down the center aisle, methodically shooting worshippers in the pews and pausing only to reload his weapon. During the 11-minute spree, he fired more than 700 rounds. He claimed 26 victims and injured 20 others in what would become the deadliest mass shooting in Texas history. Kelly then entered a fire exchange with residents and former NRA shooting instructor Stephen Williford. Also armed with an AR-15 variant, he'd taken cover behind a truck and shot Kelly twice in the leg and in the upper torso, causing him to drop his rifle. Before speeding away in his SUV, Kelly returned fire with a handgun. Williford then entered a pickup truck, driven by a man named Johnny Langendorf. and the two started pursuing Kelly. The men called 911 during the 7-minute chase, in which they reached speeds of up to 95 miles per hour. Kelly eventually slammed into a road sign, crossed the borrow ditch, and came to a stop in a field. The police would find his lifeless body inside the vehicle with 3 gunshot injuries, including a self-inflicted one to the head. In spite of speculation towards his affiliation with various extreme groups, or that the shooting had been motivated by religious prejudice or racism, investigators ultimately attributed it to Kelly's own fragile mental state and a dispute he'd had with his mother-in-law. Number 8. Victor Cuevas. In 2017, Victor Cuevas was accused of fatally shooting a man outside the Bella Terra shopping mall in Richmond. He was subsequently released on a $125,000 bond, but in May of 2021, Cuevas once again found himself in front of a judge. This time it was because his pet Bengal tiger, India, was spotted prowling through a Houston neighborhood. The tiger came face to face with an off-duty Waller County deputy before being pulled away by his owner. As the police arrived at the scene, Cuevas evaded arrest and fled with the 175-pound beast in the back of his SUV. While it's legal to own a tiger in Texas, it can't be held within city limits. Cuevas was arrested, but India remained missing for roughly 8 days. There was significant concern from the public that a tiger was on the loose in Houston. After moving India through various safe houses, Cuevas' wife, Gia, eventually turned him into Houston PD. The tiger was relocated to a wildlife sanctuary in Murchison. Cuevas' initial bond was revoked and a new one was set at $300,000, which he also paid, and was once again released from custody pending a trial. Number 7. Alan Bard. In 2019, a Corpus Christi man led the authorities on an unconventional chase as he tried to evade capture in his tractor. 45-year-old Alan Bard had rear-ended a vehicle and then got into a confrontation with the driver. When the police arrived at the scene, an officer approached Bard with the intention of bringing him into custody. It was at that moment that Bard drove off in his John Deere tractor, dragging the officer with him. It was later reported that the officer had sustained injuries to his shoulder. Bard then engaged the police in an hour-long chase. 2 4x4 squad cars trailed him into a field. Another officer then cut off the tractor and held Bard at gunpoint, effectively putting an end to the pursuit. He was removed from the vehicle and detained on charges of evading arrest and aggravated assault of a police officer. Number 6. Brenda Delgado. In 2019, Brenda Delgado was sentenced to life in prison for masterminding the murder of Kendra Hatcher out of jealous rage. In 2015, Delgado's boyfriend, Ricardo Paniagua, ended their relationship after the pair had been seeing each other on and off for several years. Paniagua felt that they'd left things on a positive note, but had no idea of the obsession Delgado harbored towards him. The 33-year-old tracked his whereabouts via the GPS in his phone and routinely monitored his emails and messages. A few months after the breakup, Paniagua met pediatric dentist Kendra Hatcher on an online dating site. Upon learning that Paniagua had flown his new girlfriend out to San Francisco to meet his parents, Delgado's jealousy reached a boiling point, and she made the decision to kill her perceived rival. She enlisted accomplices 27-year-old Crystal Cortez and Christopher Love, aged 35. Delgado promised them money and drugs through unsubstantiated claims that she had cartel connections. Love acted as the triggerman and Cortez was meant to be the getaway driver. Delgado had told them to cover their tracks by making the killing look like a robbery. On September the 2nd of 2015, Love fatally shot Hatcher in the back of the head in the parking lot of her Dallas apartment complex. A few weeks later, the accomplices were arrested, but by that point, Delgado had fled to Mexico, where she had citizenship. She was placed on the FBI's most wanted list, with a $100,000 reward for information leading to her capture. After a few months spent in hiding, she was arrested in Mexico and extradited to the US on the condition that capital punishment won't be pursued. Cortez, who testified against the other two, was sentenced to 35 years with parole, while Love was sentenced to death via lethal injection. Number 5. Samantha Lopez. In late May of 2021, a woman was gunned down in San Antonio in front of her young children. At around 7 a.m., Samantha Lopez was getting her daughters ready for school outside MC Belden Apartments. The attacker approached 28-year-old Lopez and shot her once from behind and then again as she lay on the ground. The children, aged 2, 6, and 10, are believed to have witnessed the murder but were unharmed. An unnamed man identified as the woman's estranged husband was brought in for questioning. Lopez had had a protective order against him, and he'd been arrested multiple times for violating it. According to a preliminary investigation, the estranged husband was the main suspect in the shooting, but he hasn't been officially charged at this point in time. Number 4. Charles Albright. Charles Albright was one of the most terrifying serial killers to operate in the state of Texas, also known as the Eyeball Killer. He was arrested for one murder in 1991, but is strongly suspected to have committed at least another 2. In December of 1990, Mary Lou Pratt, a well-known prostitute in Dallas's Oak Cliff neighborhood, was found dead, only clothed in a bra and t-shirt. 33-year-old Pratt had been badly beaten and then shot in the head. A coroner stated that the killer had taken both her eyes after removing them with surgical precision. In February of the following year, 27-year-old Susan Beth Peterson, who was also a prostitute, was found on the same street as Pratt. She'd been shot in her left breast as well as in the back and through the top of her head. The killer had removed both her eyes. In March, the nude body of Shirley Williams was found propped up against a curb near an elementary school. When a medical field agent pulled back her eyelids, he realized her eyes were missing. Like the previous 2, she'd been beaten and shot in the head. The authorities were only able to concretely connect Albright to Williams's murder through hair found at the scene that matched his, as the rest of the evidence was deemed circumstantial. Albright was imprisoned at a psychiatric unit in Lubbock, where he died in 2020. Number 3. Murder of Adrian Wells. In 2019, a young man was killed in Dallas in a robbery gone awry. The day after 18-year-old Sydney Whitaker had first met Adrian Wells, aged 21, she called him to meet at his apartment, promising intimate relations. Wells was lured outside, at which point 3 armed robbers forced him back into the apartment, demanding cash. The intruders opened fire upon discovering there were other people at the residence. Wells was fatally shot while a 45-year-old man, whose identity wasn't released, was critically wounded. A witness would report that after hearing the gunshots, he saw Whitaker, who bore a distinctive facial tattoo, running from the area. When asked if she was all right, the teenager replied, no. She then called the police, saying that she had information about Wells's murder but didn't show up at the station after agreeing to an interview. She was eventually arrested and charged with capital murder along with Tyrone Williams and Jeroy Rogers, both in their early 20s. Number 2. Genesis Corneo Alvarado. The murder of Genesis Corneo Alvarado is among the most brutal to have occurred in Texas in recent years. On February the 16th of 2017, the body of a teenager who'd been shot twice at close range was found on Sharpcrest Street in southwest Houston. In March, the body was identified as that of Corneo, who had been reported missing about a month prior. The 15-year-old and another teenager had been kidnapped and held captive by Miguel Alvarez Flores and Diego Hernandez Rivera. The illegal immigrants from El Salvador were self-described Satanists and members of the MS-13 gang. After kidnapping Corneo, they gave her drugs and abused her for a month. The other teenage victim went through the same ordeal and was also forcibly tattooed by Alvarez. She was able to escape and led the authorities back to the men while also giving an account of the circumstances surrounding Corneo's murder. She'd reportedly been killed for criticizing a satanic statue nicknamed the Beast, which was at the apartment. Alvarez took offense and, after offering the shrine a cigarette, claimed that it wanted a soul instead. Hernandez confessed to the killing after the pair was arrested. They were each sentenced to 40 years for murder and aggravated kidnapping. During their arraignment, they caused public outcry as they laughed and waved at the cameras. Number 1. Sutherland Springs church shooting. On November the 5th of 2017, Devin Patrick Kelly parked his Ford Explorer SUV in the front of the First Baptist Church in Sutherland Springs and emerged armed with a Ruger AR-556 semi-automatic rifle. Kelly, who was wearing a bulletproof vest and a black face mask with a white skull on it, gunned down 2 people in front of the church. He continued firing on the building where people were attending Sunday service and then entered shouting, "Everybody dies." Kelly walked up and down the center aisle, methodically shooting worshippers in the pews and pausing only to reload his weapon. During the 11-minute spree, he fired more than 700 rounds. He claimed 26 victims and injured 20 others in what would become the deadliest mass shooting in Texas history. Kelly then entered a fire exchange with residents and former NRA shooting instructor Stephen Williford. also armed with an AR-15 variant, he'd taken cover behind a truck and shot Kelly twice in the leg and in the upper torso, causing him to drop his rifle. Before speeding away in his SUV, Kelly returned fire with a handgun. Williford then entered a pickup truck, driven by a man named Johnny Langendorf, and the two started pursuing Kelly. The men called 911 during the 7-minute chase, in which they reached speeds of up to 95 miles per hour. Kelly eventually slammed into a road sign, crossed a borrow ditch, and came to a stop in a field. The police would find his lifeless body inside the vehicle with 3 gunshot injuries, including a self-inflicted one to the head, in spite of speculation towards his affiliation with various extreme groups, or that the shooting had been motivated by religious prejudice or racism. Investigators ultimately attributed it to Kelly's own fragile mental state and a dispute he'd had with his mother-in-law. Number 7. Peter Chadwick. On October the 10th of 2012, police were called to a home in Newport Beach belonging to millionaire Peter Chadwick and his wife, Ki Chu. A welfare check had been requested after neither of the homeowners had picked up their children from their private school in Huntington Beach that day. After gaining access to the residence, officers reportedly found several pieces of evidence that suggested a violent altercation had taken place. The clues included a broken vase and bloodstains in an upstairs bathroom. It was also discovered that a safe in one of the downstairs offices had been emptied and left open. The following day, Chadwick called 911 from a payphone to report that his wife had been murdered by a house painter named Juan. During the man's subsequent interviews with the police, detectives noticed scratches on his neck and dried blood on his hands, and it was ultimately determined that Juan had been a fabrication. Chadwick was thus arrested on suspicion of murdering his wife. 2 months later, he was released on $1 million bail on the condition that he surrendered his passports. Chadwick reportedly moved in with his father in Santa Barbara for the next couple of years, but in 2015 he failed to show up for a scheduled court hearing. An investigation into his whereabouts was set into motion, and U.S. Marshals quickly uncovered that the man had recently withdrawn millions from his bank accounts. The manhunt continued for more than 4 years until Chadwick was finally located near Puebla, Mexico, where he was taken into custody with the help of local authorities. It subsequently emerged that the millionaire fugitive had posed as a spy and used a fake ID card from the Marvel TV show Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. while on the run. Chadwick pleaded guilty to strangling and drowning his wife in the bathroom of their Newport Beach mansion before discarding her body in a dumpster in San Diego. He was ultimately sentenced to 15 years to life in prison in February of 2022. Number 6. Alexandra Suvaneva. A forest fire broke out roughly 12 miles from the city of Redding on the east side of Interstate 5 on September the 22nd of 2021. During the next 10 days, the blaze, dubbed the Fawn Fire, burned an estimated 8,578 acres of land, destroying 185 buildings and damaging another 26. 3 firefighters were reported to have been injured while working to contain the rapidly expanding flames. It was ultimately determined that the fire had been deliberately started by Palo Alto resident Alexandra Suvaneva, aged 30. She'd been spotted trespassing on a remote canyon property belonging to J.F. Shea and Mountain Gate Quarries on the morning of the fire's ignition. Court records detailed how Suvaneva had been found by law enforcement officers with a bag containing CO2 cartridges and a cigarette lighter. She was consequently booked into the Shasta County Jail on suspicion of forest land arson. The woman was reportedly dehydrated when fire department personnel came upon her in the brush near the fire line. In November of 2021, a judge declared that Suvaneva was mentally unfit to stand trial, and her case was thereupon placed on hold until she could be evaluated for placement in a mental institution. Number 5. Joseph Jimenez. TikTok star Anthony Barajas, aged 19, went to a movie theater in Corona, California with a female companion on the evening of July the 26th of 2021. Following the theater's final showing of the night, an employee reportedly found that the 2 teens had been left critically injured after being shot in the head as they sat in their seats. Barajas' friend, identified as 18-year-old Riley Goodrich, was already dead upon the arrival of first responders. Barajas was rushed to the hospital where he was kept on life support for several days following the incident. With the help of eyewitness testimony, authorities were able to identify 20-year-old Joseph Jimenez as the main suspect in the case. Investigators reportedly found that the alleged gunman had no prior relationship with either of the 2 victims, and it was concluded that the attack had been completely unprovoked and devoid of any clear-cut motive. Jimenez was booked into the Riverside Presley Detention Center and charged with the murder of Goodrich and attempted murder of Barajas. On August 1st, it was reported that the latter had succumbed to his injuries while being treated at the hospital, at which point Jimenez's charges were amended to include a second murder count. In an interview with the Riverside Press Enterprise, the suspect claimed that he'd been driven to commit the double homicide by voices in his head, which had purportedly told him that his family would be killed if he refused to do as they demanded. Number 4. Eric John Montgomery and Peaches Sochev. On the morning of November the 28th of 2018, narcotics detectives searched the Visalia residence of Eric John Montgomery and Peaches Sochev. The officers were reportedly joined by a special enforcement unit and the Tulare Area Regional Gang Enforcement Team during the search, which ended with both homeowners being taken into custody. The suspects were subsequently booked into the Tulare County pretrial facility on suspicion of possession of illegal substances with the intent to distribute. In the wake of the couple's arrest, Montgomery's mugshot went viral on social media. The strong reactions to the photograph were in large part due to the presence of a bulbous growth on the man's forehead. Officers claimed that the bump stemmed from a medical condition from which the man suffered. They maintained that it had no connection to the police's handling of Montgomery during his arrest, as had been theorized by some. The suspect's bail was set at $50,000 each. Number 3. The Golden Gate Bridge Daredevils. Two self-professed daredevils from Allenton, Wisconsin, took a trip to San Francisco in April of 2017 with the intention of climbing the Golden Gate Bridge. The pair were identified as 18-year-old YouTuber Peter Cura and his exploration companion Thomas Rector, aged 21. As was captured in a 5-minute clip later posted online, the two young men climbed to the top of the landmark bridge's North Tower. They were shown performing backflips and somersaults on some of the structure's narrow walkways during the ascent. At one point in the video, Cura and Rector were dangling over the edge of the 746-foot tower by their fingertips, all without the aid of any safety equipment. While the pair fortunately came away from the reckless stunt without any injuries, they did face legal trouble once the footage of their escapade began circulating on social media. The Marin County District Attorney ordered that both Cura and Rector appear in court on charges of misdemeanor trespassing and climbing a toll bridge. The maximum penalty associated with their charges was 1 year behind bars. However, in October of 2017, it was reported that the Daredevil duo had plans to take a plea deal that would spare them any jail time. Number 2. William Wallace. After leaving a neighbor's Christmas Eve party in 2011, William Wallace got into a heated argument with his girlfriend, college student Zazelle Preston, at their Anaheim residence. The man was said to have flown into a drunken rage as the dispute escalated, and he pushed Preston into a glass table which reportedly shattered upon impact. During the case's subsequent trial, the woman's eldest daughter recounted how she'd helped pull shards of broken glass from her mother's body before Wallace carried her into the bathroom to clean her wounds. As he did so, however, he lost his grasp of Preston, and the woman's head consequently smashed into the toilet seat. Preston's daughter remembered that her mother's body was cold as Wallace brought her into their shared bedroom. The following morning, as the children were opening their Christmas presents, Wallace dragged Preston into the living room and propped her body up on the couch before placing a pair of sunglasses over her eyes. He reportedly told the children that Mummy got drunk and ruined Christmas. Paramedics were later called to the home, where they found Preston's body slumped over the sofa. She was pronounced dead at the scene. During a search of the apartment, investigators found multiple blood stains in various rooms, as well as a door that had been knocked off its hinges and a hole in a wall that had presumably been caused by a punch. Preston's relatives described Wallace as controlling and violent and claimed that the couple had been involved in several other incidents of domestic violence in the past before her tragic death. Preston was mere weeks from graduating with a degree from Cypress College, with a future plan of becoming a domestic violence counselor. In June of 2021, Wallace was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison following his conviction on a charge of second-degree murder. Number 1. The Golden State Killer. Sacramento County Sheriff's deputies took former police officer Joseph James D'Angelo into custody on April the 24th of 2018. The arrest was the culmination of a decades-long investigation into the identity of the Golden State Killer, a nickname given to the previously unknown perpetrator of a series of brutal crimes across California between 1974
and 1986. D'Angelo was suspected to have carried out 3 separate crime sprees in different regions of the state, each of which spawned different nicknames in the press. Investigators initially believed that the 13 murders, 50 assaults, and 120 burglaries had been committed by 3 different suspects. It was eventually determined that a single individual had been responsible for all of the crimes, and the suspect was given the name Golden State Killer by crime writer Michelle McNamara. Police identified several suspects throughout the investigation, all of whom were gradually exonerated by DNA testing, alibi, or some other piece of exculpatory evidence. In June of 2016, the FBI announced that they were renewing their efforts to identify the infamous serial killer and offered a $50,000 reward for his capture 4 months before the arrest was made. Officials had uploaded a DNA profile of the suspect to the personal genomics website GED Match. With the help of genealogist Barbara Way Venter, 2 possible Golden State Killer identities emerged, one of whom was subsequently ruled out by a relative's DNA test. At that point, the only remaining suspect was D'Angelo, whose DNA was collected from the handle of his car door. It was reported that neither his wife nor his children had suspected him of any wrongdoing and were therefore shocked and devastated upon hearing the details of his gruesome crimes. In August of 2020, D'Angelo, who by that time was 74 years old, pleaded guilty to a slew of charges and was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Number 8. William Wood. In the early morning hours of September the 15th of 2018, a masked gunman entered a Chili's in the town of DeWitt while employees were closing up the establishment. The suspect ordered 3 of the workers to get on the floor, then pointed the firearm at the manager, identified as Stephen Gudnecht, and demanded he open the safe. Upon doing so, however, Gudnecht revealed that the restaurant had very little cash on hand, to which the gunman reacted by fatally shooting him in the head. The assailant subsequently walked over to the other employees and fired a round at Christopher Hicks, who later died while being transported to the hospital. The gunman attempted to shoot another worker, but his weapon malfunctioned and he fled the scene. The employees who'd survived the ambush attack promptly called the police. It soon emerged that the individual responsible for the deadly robbery was a disgruntled former Chili's employee named William Wood. In August of 2021, the 33-year-old pleaded guilty to 1 count of robbery and 2 counts of using a firearm in the furtherance of a crime of violence and murder. Although prosecutors initially announced their plans to seek the death penalty for Wood, he was ultimately sentenced to 2 life terms instead. Number 7. Javier Da Silva. On the night of January the 28th of 2019, Valerie Reyes frantically called her mother to express her pervasive feelings of anxiety stemming from the belief that someone was going to try to kill her. The next day, the 24-year-old went missing from her home in the small upstate town of New Rochelle, triggering a widespread search effort that extended into neighboring states. A week after Reyes' initial disappearance, the authorities located her lifeless body inside a suitcase that had been discarded on the side of the highway in Greenwich, Connecticut. In the immediate aftermath of her remains being discovered, Reyes' ex-boyfriend was identified as a possible suspect in her kidnapping and murder, as the pair had just broken up shortly before she went missing. On February the 12th, however, the police in Greenwich arrested another of Reyes' ex-boyfriends, Javier Da Silva, whose relationship with the victim had reportedly come to an end in mid-2018, as was discovered during a subsequent police investigation. Da Silva, aged 24, had driven to Reyes' apartment in the early morning hours of January the 29th. They got into an altercation during which Reyes reportedly suffered head trauma and bruising to her face. In the moments that followed, Da Silva bound and gagged the young woman before stuffing her inside a suitcase and using her debit card to withdraw $1,000 at an ATM in New Rochelle. He then drove to Greenwich, where he dumped the suitcase in a wooded area off of Glenville Road. In September of 2021, Da Silva was convicted of Reyes' murder, and he was consequently sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. Number 6. Brianna Scarpula. On June the 10th of 2018, Brianna Scarpula was traveling down Latta Road in the town of Greece at a speed of over 70 miles per hour. Her best friend and fellow Hilton High School varsity cheerleader, Paige Smith, was in the car with her at the time. Subsequent reports detailed how Scarpula was attempting to get the attention of passengers in another vehicle on the roadway when she suddenly lost control of her own car. The 18-year-old then overcorrected her vehicle's path, causing it to cross over the painted center line and crash directly into an oncoming SUV. Both Scarpula and Smith were left in critical condition following the violent collision, and the latter ultimately passed away as a result of her extensive injuries. The driver of the SUV, later named as Mary Kay Mayuri, was reported to have suffered a broken left foot and ankle in the crash, requiring her to undergo multiple reconstructive surgeries. After spending about 2 weeks at Strong Memorial Hospital in Rochester, Scarpula was released shortly before Hilton High School's graduation ceremony. The teenager's toxicology report indicated that she hadn't been under the influence of drugs or alcohol at the time of the fatal accident. In June of 2019, she pleaded guilty to charges of criminally negligent homicide and reckless driving. As part of her plea agreement with prosecutors, Scarpula was sentenced to 1 to 3 years of probation. Number 5. Winston Glynn. On January the 9th of 2022, a man walked into a Burger King in Manhattan and struck the manager on duty with a handgun. He proceeded to attack one of the 2 customers that were in the restaurant at the time as well, and then pointed the gun at the cashier and demanded money. The employee, later named as 19-year-old Crystal Byron Neves, complied with the armed man's commands and reportedly handed him $100 from the cash register. The assailant fatally shot Byron Neves in the stomach in spite of her cooperation before stealing the manager's cell phone and fleeing the scene. The New York Police Department subsequently released surveillance footage of the suspect, who was eventually identified as a homeless man named Winston Glynn. The 30-year-old was taken into police custody on January the 13th, and he reportedly faced a charge of murder in addition to other felony offenses. The authorities revealed that Glynn had 7 prior arrests on his record stemming from instances of menacing, criminal possession of a weapon, and assault. On the same night as Glynn's capture, a candle-lit vigil was held in Byron Neves' honor outside the Burger King where she'd worked. Number 4. The assault and robbery of Nina Rothschild. A researcher for New York City's Department of Health was making her way into a Queens subway station after work on February the 24th of 2022 when she was suddenly attacked by a man wielding a hammer. Surveillance footage taken from outside the station showed the suspect walking with a cane as he approached the victim, 58-year-old Nina Rothschild. The latter had begun walking down the stairs to the subway platform when the man kicked her in the back, apparently attempting to knock her over. Rothschild stayed on her feet and attempted to flee, but the assailant then took out a hammer and bashed the woman over the head an estimated 13 times. The victim was taken to Weill Cornell Medicine in critical condition after her attacker, later named as career criminal William Blount, absconded with her purse, which contained a cell phone, bank cards, and an unknown sum of cash. On February the 27th, Blount was arrested and charged with attempted murder, robbery, and assault. A second suspect, Queens resident Denise Alston, was taken into police custody in connection to the incident. She'd reportedly used Rothschild's stolen credit card the day after the attack and consequently faced several charges, including criminal possession of stolen property and identity theft. Number 3. Asmad Nash. Manhattan advertising professional Christina Yuna Lee returned to her Chinatown residence in the early hours of February the 13th of 2022 after spending the night at a club. Upon entering her apartment, the 35-year-old was brutally attacked by a man who followed her home. According to the resulting police report, Lee was stabbed over 40 times with one of her kitchen knives. Neighbors who'd been awakened by her pained cries for help promptly called 911. Police officers had been patrolling an area nearby when the call went out, which allowed them to descend upon Lee's apartment almost instantly. By that time, the assailant had barricaded himself inside the home, and it reportedly took the officers about 90 minutes to finally gain entry. They then found Lee's mutilated body unclothed inside her bathtub. The officers also came upon her bloodied killer, identified as Asmad Nash, who was hiding underneath the bed with a bloody wound on his torso as well as lacerations to his hands and shoulder. The knife believed to have been used during the fatal attack was located behind a dresser in the victim's bedroom. It subsequently emerged that leading up to the gruesome murder, Nash had been arrested a total of 7 times since 2017 and still had 3 open cases at Manhattan Criminal Court. Number 2. Michael J. Snow. SUNY Potsdam student Elizabeth Howell was found unconscious on the side of the road near the university's Crane School of Music on the evening of February the 18th of 2022. Police officers were rushed to the scene and initiated life-saving measures for the 21-year-old, who had sustained multiple gunshot wounds. She was then transported to Canton Potsdam Hospital, where she ultimately died about an hour later. Investigators quickly identified local man Michael J. Snow as the prime suspect in Howell's murder. The following day, police conducted a raid of the 31-year-old's residence, which resulted in the alleged killer being taken into custody. As indicated by court records, Snow was subsequently charged with second-degree murder. It wasn't immediately known whether he had a pre-existing relationship with the victim, but SUNY Potsdam did issue a statement in which they claimed that the man had no affiliation with the college, either as a student, employee, or graduate. Howell, who performed with the Crane Symphony Orchestra as a cellist, was in her final semester at the university at the time of her tragic death. Number 1. Tyler LoPresti-Castro. Shortly before 7 a.m. on January the 27th of 2022, a pair of Wanonta public transit employees came upon the frozen, lifeless body of a local college student near the intersection of Interstate 88 and Route 205. Emergency medical personnel attempted to resuscitate the young man, but he was ultimately pronounced dead after being taken to A.O. Fox Memorial Hospital. The authorities were able to identify him as 20-year-old Tyler LoPresti-Castro by using the SUNY Wanonta student ID card that was found in his possession. Local police determined that LoPresti-Castro had left the party at around midnight on January the 27th and began walking home alone. A witness claimed to have seen a man matching LoPresti-Castro's description walking along an I-88 exit ramp at about 1 a.m. The young man was later captured by the security camera at the Silas Lane Transit Garage, where his body was ultimately found. It was reported that LoPresti-Castro had unspecified levels of alcohol and caffeine in his system at the time of his death. Investigators found no evidence of criminal activity or foul play in connection to the student's untimely passing.
Number 8. Julio Novello. One of the most brazen thefts to have occurred in New York in recent history was carried out by Julio Novello in 2016. The man had been a career thief ever since he'd come to the city from Ecuador in the late 1980s. He started with electronics before moving on to jewelry. As a result of his crimes, Novello was deported to his native country 4 times between 1994 and 2008. He would make his way back to New York using aliases and fake passports. In September of 2016, he saw an opportunity to seize what he'd later describe as the Super Bowl of thefts. He spotted a large gold-filled bucket in the back of an armored truck in Manhattan. While the 2 guards were distracted, Novello approached the back of the truck and then made off with over 90 pounds of gold. He would later state that the theft took him less than 10 seconds. Security cameras captured Novello as he struggled to carry the heavy bucket down the busy Manhattan streets in broad daylight. After he took the loot to safety, Novello realized that he had in his possession 2 massive gold bars, each about a foot long. He was able to quickly secure deals and converted the gold to roughly $1.6 million in cash. Even though the videos of the heist had started circulating around the world, Novello managed to flee the US and reach Ecuador. He'd reportedly made plans with his then-fiancée to send him the rest of his money once he got settled. According to Novello, the woman only sent him $50,000. What happened to the rest remains a mystery, but Novello believes that his fiancée and her new lover had kept the cash in spite of her claims that the police had seized it. Novello was eventually captured by undercover Ecuadorian officers, but wasn't extradited to the US. Because he had a good record in his home country, he spent less than a year in jail. His notoriety as the Golden Boy would ultimately condemn him to a life of paranoia in Ecuador. He feared being robbed or killed for the famed fortune that, according to him, he no longer possessed. Number 7. 303 East 51st Street crane collapse. On March the 15th of 2008, a crane collapse in Manhattan resulted in the death of 7 people. The incident occurred while a skyscraper was being built at 303 East 51st Street. Workers were attaching tower sections, meant to extend a 200-foot crane upwards. It's a procedure that's commonly referred to as jumping the crane. A steel collar meant to tie the crane to the skyscraper at the 18th floor fell as the crew was attempting to install it. A chain reaction ensued. A collar at the 9th floor, which served as a major anchoring point, also failed. A subsequent investigation would determine that the crew had used only half the amount of polyester slings recommended to keep the collar in place. As the collar fell, it damaged others in the lower levels. Left without any lateral support, the crane toppled. It landed on a 4-story residential building opposite to it, causing considerable damage. Mayor Michael Bloomberg referred to the crane collapse as the worst construction accident in New York's recent history. Aside from the fatalities, at least 24 other people were injured. Number 6. Erica Tishman. In December of 2019, a New York City architect was killed by a chunk of fallen masonry while walking down 729 7th Avenue in Midtown Manhattan. 60-year-old Erica Tishman's office was only a few blocks from the building. The mother of 3 was struck by debris that had fallen from over a dozen stories and was pronounced dead at the scene. The 17th story building dated back to 1915, and as recently as October, inspectors had noted damaged terracotta in its upper floors, which represented a falling hazard for the busy street below. The Department of Buildings had determined the structure to be a Class 1 violation, meaning that the owners were advised to urgently correct the issue. In spite of the professional assessment, the sidewalk sheds meant to protect pedestrians never went up. Scaffolding was hastily mounted on the building only after Tishman's death. There's an ongoing lawsuit filed by her widower against the city and the building's owners. It alleges they were aware of the risks months prior to the incident, but had done nothing to mend the situation. Number 5. Lance Margolin. In April of 2021, a 59-year-old man was fatally struck by a falling pole in Brooklyn. Lance Margolin, accompanied by his wife and a few of their friends, was returning from a birthday party shortly after 7 p.m. Around the same time, a Metropolitan Transportation Authority bus was navigating around a disabled vehicle and in the process hit a pole. Margolin's friends heard a loud bang and they'd initially thought that the man's wife had been hit by the vehicle. As they ran over, they saw Margolin with the pole lying on top of him. One of his friends managed to lift it, and Margolin was subsequently rushed to a hospital. Unfortunately, his injuries proved too severe and he passed away within a few days. The MTA bus driver was suspended, pending an internal investigation. Number 4. Karina Vetrano. In early August of 2016, New York woman Karina Vetrano disappeared after she'd gone for a run in Spring Creek Park. Vetrano usually ran with her father, but he couldn't join her due to a back injury. He'd expressed concerns about her going out alone. After multiple call and texts had gone unanswered, Vetrano's father put together a search party. At around 11 p.m., he found her body face down about 15 feet from the trail. She'd been abused and strangled to death. Her neck had been squeezed so tightly that there was a palm print on her neck. Her panties and sports bra had been pulled down and she was covered in scratches and bruises. There was also evidence that she'd been struck in the back of the head with a rock. 30-year-old Vetrano had put up a ferocious fight, biting her attacker so hard that there were stress cracks in her teeth. The DNA of her attacker was found on her back, under her fingernails, and on her phone, which was recovered several feet away from her body. Hundreds of DNA samples were examined in the ensuing investigation, but the police were initially unsuccessful in finding a suspect. It took 6 months before the DNA from the crime scene was matched with that of 20-year-old Chanel Lewis. He lived in a low-income housing neighborhood in East New York, less than 3 miles from the park where Vetrano had been found dead. Lewis didn't have a criminal record, but was described as being mentally unstable and harboring feelings of hatred towards women. While still in school a few years prior, he reportedly told a teacher's aide that he wanted to stab all the girls. The night of Vetrano's murder, he'd returned home looking disheveled with a hand injury, as well as cuts and scratches on his upper body. Lewis told his family he'd been mugged by a group of men, but there was no evidence of such an attack. During Lewis's trial, a forensic biologist claimed that the chance of someone else sharing his DNA profile was 1 in 6 trillion. In April of 2019, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Number 3. Robert Martinez. In 2018, a civilian working for the New York City Police Department was killed in a freak freeway accident involving a loose tire. 64-year-old Robert Martinez, who worked in building maintenance at the NYPD headquarters in Manhattan, was driving his Chevy Tracker on the Gowanus Expressway in Brooklyn. A rear tire from a garbage truck traveling in the opposite direction somehow became unhinged and flew over the center median. It hit Martinez's windshield, shattering it and causing him to crash into the divider. The emergency services found him unresponsive and rushed him to New York University Langone Hospital. Martinez had suffered extensive head trauma to which he eventually succumbed while hospitalized. Number 2. Jared Woodbury. In January of 2020, 42-year-old Jared Woodbury turned himself in at the Manhattan Criminal Court, admitting that he was the man responsible for a string of recent robberies. Perhaps the most shocking aspect was that Woodbury had actually been arrested in the midst of his spree. Woodbury's MO involved handing notes to bank tellers in Brooklyn and Manhattan demanding money. After his fourth heist, Woodbury had been arrested but promptly released without bail on January the 8th. That's because on January the 1st, new bail reform legislation had taken effect which barred judges from setting bail for non-violent offenders. Sources claim that as he was gathering his belongings from the NYPD headquarters, Woodbury had expressed bewilderment and said, "I can't believe they let me out." Woodbury went on to rob 2 more banks, one of them less than 4 hours after his release. Even after he'd turned himself in, and despite the obvious risk, there was still no legal grounds to hold him on bail under the new legislation. That's because he hadn't used a weapon or exhibited violence during his crimes. However, because one of the banks Woodbury had robbed was federally insured, federal prosecutors took control of the case. Unlike state legal authorities, they had the power to hold him. Woodbury thus faced federal bank robbery charges which held a maximum sentence of 20 years in prison. Number 1. Visaya Hoffy. On January the 11th of 2020, an Australian tourist suffered an horrific accident at the 14th Street Pass Station. 23-year-old Visaya Hoffy from Brisbane had tripped and fallen onto the tracks at around 4 a.m. She was wearing a dark puffy jacket and black jeans which made her virtually invisible to the conductor of an oncoming train. Hoffy was run over by all 7 cars. 20 minutes after Hoffy's body had been left mangled on the tracks, another train was approaching. Fortunately, the woman's bright pink shirt had been exposed, making her more visible, and the conductor was able to stop in time. She was taken to Bellevue Hospital with head trauma and devastating injuries to her lower body. Hoffy had multiple surgeries that included the amputation of both her legs. The fact that she survived after being run over by a train was described as miraculous. According to the latest updates on her condition, the young woman had returned to Australia where she continued her recovery.
Number 7. Richard Chavez. 20-year-old nursing student Charisma Ereshman was reported missing after being last seen leaving her Forest View home on January the 23rd of 2022. Several days later, she was found unresponsive and with a jacket covering her face in the backseat of a car in the 5900 block of West Iowa Street. Ereshman was pronounced dead at the scene, and the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office ruled it a homicide by strangulation and smothering. A police investigation revealed 24-year-old Richard Chavez as the primary suspect in her killing. Cell phone records indicated that he and Ereshman had been talking online and that the young woman had driven to his Oak Park home on January the 23rd. A private surveillance camera recorded him walking on the sidewalk at about 10:40 p.m. and going inside with Ereshman. She wasn't seen leaving the residence, and the following morning, Chavez drove her car to the location where it was subsequently found. He then called his brother to give him a lift less than a mile away. After he was taken into custody, Chavez told the police that he and Ereshman had consensual relations and that she'd left his home by the time he woke up. While he was being detained, the man phoned his parents in a recorded call telling them to get his passport ready. The case is ongoing, and as of the latest updates, Chavez had been denied bail. Number 6. Antonio Alvarez. Bodies of 30-year-old Illinois State Police Trooper Antonio Alvarez and his wife, Amanda Alvarez Callo, aged 31, were found in a parked car of Chicago's South Side in January of 2022. Both were pronounced dead at the scene from gunshot wounds to the head. As reported by the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office, Amanda's death was ruled a homicide, while the gunshot that had ended Antonio's life appeared to have been self-inflicted. The trooper, a 3-year veteran of the force, and his wife, who worked as a school teacher at Matthew Gallistell Learning Academy, had been having marital problems and were separated. Relatives told the authorities that Amanda had stated plans of leaving her husband and starting a new chapter. It's believed that she'd shared her resolve with Antonio, who then shot her before turning the weapon, which was subsequently recovered from the vehicle, on himself. The couple were survived by 2 young children aged 1 and 4, who were placed in the care of relatives in the tragedy's aftermath. Number 5. Carlton Weekly. While shopping in the upscale Gold Coast community on August the 4th of 2020, rapper FBG Duck was shot multiple times in an attack carried out in broad daylight. The 26-year-old rapper, known as Carlton Weekly, which was his real name, sustained injuries to the groin, chest, and neck. A video circulated on social media in the shooting's wake showed a man in a blue tracksuit, believed to be Weekly, lying face down on the street with 2 officers near him. The bystander who'd taken the video was heard saying, "They shot FBG Duck," in the audio of the footage. The rapper, who was part of the Flyboy gang and signed to Sony Records, was left in critical condition. He was rushed to Northwestern Memorial Hospital, where he was later pronounced dead. 2 others, a 26-year-old woman and a man in his mid-30s, were severely injured in the shooting, but were subsequently reported to have survived. A federal indictment was unsealed in October of 2021, and it revealed the names of the 5 men who'd been taken into custody and charged with murder in connection to the incident. Aged 22 to 30, they were reported members of the O-Block Street gang, who violently protected its territories on the south side and claimed responsibility for various acts of violence in the city. Weekly, who often rapped about gun violence, was allegedly affiliated with a rival gang. The authorities reported he'd made derogatory statements about O-Block, which was identified as a possible motive behind the shooting. According to the indictment, Charles Liggins, Kenneth Roberson, Tar Carlos Offord, Christopher Thomas, and Marcus Smart emerged from 2 vehicles and fired approximately 38 shots at Weekly. The men were charged with committing murder in aid of racketeering, assault in the aid of racketeering, and various weapons charges. If the reputed gangsters were found guilty, they faced a minimum sentence of life in prison or the death penalty. Number 4. Tremont Hill. In January of 2019, a student athlete at Phillips High School was charged with murder in the death of a transgender escort with whom he'd been having an intimate relationship. On August the 30th of 2018, Tremont Hill, a high school basketball star and father of 1, lured Dejanae Stanton to a secluded area in the 4000 block of South Calumet Avenue in Bronzeville. It was there that the teenager was alleged to have fatally shot 24-year-old Stanton in the head. In the aftermath, the police analyzed texts exchanged between the two starting on July the 22nd. Hill had lied that he was 18 years old and told Scranton that he was interested in a physical relationship with her. Later that same day, they met at a Southside hotel and had intercourse. Subsequent communication between them underlined an inner conflict on Hill's part, stemming from Scranton being a transgender woman. The 17-year-old told her that he'd been having thoughts of self-harm since their last encounter. They arranged the August 30th meeting where Hill allegedly killed his former lover in cold blood. A search warrant served at the teen's home turned up a shirt and pants matching those seen on surveillance video, and the clothing exhibited small blood stains. Hill was charged as an adult and, if convicted, faced a sentence of life in prison, while in the murder's aftermath, activists call for safety measures to prevent future violence against transgender women. Number 3. Kailyn Pryor. A street in Chicago was renamed in the spring of 2022 to honor the memory of a young woman who'd been gunned down roughly 6 years previously. 20-year-old Kailyn Pryor had just won a modeling contract out of 500 competitors and was on the verge of a promising career before her life was cut short in November of 2015. She'd grown up in Evanston and was on her way to catch a bus after visiting her grandmother in Englewood. Someone opened fire from a passing SUV, and the young woman, who wasn't believed to have been the intended target, was shot and killed. No suspects were ever arrested, and the model's murder remained unsolved as of the latest updates. In April of 2022, family and friends returned to 74th and South May Street corner to unveil a sign dedicated to Pryor. In the years since her passing, the victim's father, Alan Scott, devoted his life to anti-violence causes. He expressed hopes that the sign would renew interest in Pryor's case, reminding people there was a $30,000 reward for the arrest and conviction of her killer. Number 2. Londra Sylvester. In July of 2021, moments after being released from the Cook County Jail, a local drill rapper was ambushed and shot numerous times. 31-year-old Londra Sylvester, who went by the stage name KTS Dre, died after suffering up to 64 gunshot wounds all over his body. Sylvester had walked out of the jail and towards a vehicle which had been waiting for him when unidentified shooters pulled up in 2 cars and unleashed a hail of bullets on him. A 60-year-old woman who was accompanying the rapper was shot in the knee, while a second woman who was passing through the area was grazed by a bullet in the mouth. Both victims were reported as being in good condition after receiving medical attention. A processing photo from the Cook County Sheriff's showed Sylvester with a series of prominent tattoos across his body, including a target symbol on his neck alongside the phrase, "Kill to survive." He'd been detained for violation of a bail bond after allegedly failing to meet conditions of his release in a 2020 felony gun case. It's unclear if the brutal ambush had been gang-related, a personal vendetta, or some other form of retaliation, and as per the latest information released to the media, no arrests had been made. Number 1. Chicago Rippers. In the early 1980s, Robin Gecht, along with brothers Andrew and Thomas Kokorellis and Edward Spreitzer, carried out a series of horrific killings in Chicago and the broader Illinois area. Collectively known as the Chicago Rippers or the Ripper Crew, they abused and mutilated women while they were still alive, as well as cannibalized and further desecrated their remains in death. They were reported to have taken sadistic pleasure in their crimes while operating as a satanic cult. At 30 years old, the group's eldest, Gecht, was identified as the leader and mastermind, with one detective working on the case later claiming that he made Manson look like a Boy Scout. The Rippers were suspected in the disappearances of 17 women and the unrelated random drive-by fatal shooting of 28-year-old drug dealer Rafael Tirado, their only male victim. Gecht and the others claimed their first victim on May the 23rd of 1981. They abducted 28-year-old Linda Sutton in their van, and her lifeless body was found 10 days later in a field in Villa Park, Illinois, mutilated and with her left breast amputated. The Rippers claimed several more female victims in the Chicago area, using the same modus operandi, which involved kidnapping and subjecting them to ritualistic torture and abuse prior to killing them in ways that included strangling, stabbing, or shooting. On December the 6th, 20-year-old Beverly Washington, who'd become the Rippers' last victim, was found clinging to life by a railroad track. In addition to other injuries, her left breast had been amputated and her right breast was nearly cut off. She survived and gave a detailed description of her attackers in the van they'd used, which led to their arrest. Thomas Kokorellis confessed that he and the others had abducted women and taken them to Gecht's home, called a satanic chapel. It was there that the victims were ritualistically abused and had their breasts amputated with a wire garrote, often while they were still alive. Kokorellis reported that the men would then eat portions of the severed parts as a sacrament. Gecht was also reported to have pleasured himself in them before placing the body parts in a box, in which Kokorellis said he'd once seen over a dozen of them. The victims were then executed, reportedly as Gecht read verses from the Satanic Bible. Gecht was the only one to maintain his innocence and was only convicted of attempted murder and other related charges, stemming from Washington's non-fatal abuse and assault. Deemed a devil and monster by the presiding judge, he was sentenced to 120 years in prison and will be eligible for parole in 2042. Thomas Kokorellis was given a more lenient sentence for his cooperation and released in 2019, while his brother Andrew was executed via lethal injection in 1999 and was the last inmate to be executed in the state of Illinois before capital punishment was abolished in 2011. Spreitzer, labeled by the prosecution as every woman's nightmare, was given a death sentence that was later commuted to life without parole. Number 7. Monique Borer.
On the afternoon of December the 31st of 2019, 28-year-old Monique Borer, a realtor from Minneapolis, Minnesota, received a call from someone interested in touring a house in Maple Grove. Borer got there around 3 p.m., but no one else had arrived yet. A short while later, a U-Haul van pulled up to the house. An individual emerged from the vehicle, forced Borer into the cargo area, and then drove away. Roughly 2 hours later, a masked gunman broke into the home that belonged to Borer and her boyfriend, John Mitchell Moma. The intruder had used Borer's key to get inside and proceeded to open fire on Mitchell Moma as he sat on the staircase. At the time of the shooting, his and Borer's 3-year-old child was sitting on the couch close by, and their 1-year-old was asleep upstairs. Relatives showed up to the house soon after the shooting because it had been prearranged for them to look after the couple's children, while Borer and her boyfriend were supposed to go out for New Year's Eve. It was then that they discovered Mitchell Moma with multiple gunshot wounds to his torso. He was rushed to the hospital and fortunately survived the incident. Later that night, 3 gunshots were heard being fired in an alley downtown. When the police arrived at the scene, they found Borer's body. She had been bound by the hands and feet and shot dead with the same gun that was fired at her boyfriend earlier that evening. The ensuing investigation led to the arrests and convictions of multiple suspects. Cedric Lamont Berry and Berry Davis, both aged 42, were charged with first-degree murder and given life sentences for their part in Borer's kidnapping and killing, and the attempted killing of her boyfriend. 2 other co-conspirators, 36-year-old Lyndon Wiggins and 29-year-old Elsa Segura, were handed down similar charges. Wiggins was sentenced to an additional 19 years in prison for drug trafficking. Wiggins was also found to have been the mastermind behind the plot. He had wanted to get back at Mitchell Moma over a soured record contract and enlisted the help of the 3 other perpetrators. Number 6. April Sorensen. April Sorensen, aged 27, was an aspiring dental hygienist who lived with her husband Joshua in Rochester. On April the 17th of 2007, Sorensen went about her normal routine. She worked a part-time job in the morning and attended classes at a local community college. After returning home in the early afternoon, her day took a tragic turn. A cable technician was scheduled to show up at the house for a service call at around 12:30 p.m. Upon his arrival, however, he heard Sorensen's fire alarm blaring from inside and could see a haze of smoke from the window. He called 911 and firefighters were immediately dispatched to the scene. After extinguishing the blaze, the first responders discovered Sorensen's dead body lying on the bedroom floor. Investigators subsequently conducted a thorough examination of the premises, collecting hundreds of pieces of evidence to help them ascertain what exactly had transpired. An autopsy revealed that Sorensen had been strangled and stabbed to death prior to the fire being started. The authorities determined that the house fire was used by her killer to cover up the murder. There have been multiple suspects over the course of the police investigation, including the cable technician who called in the fire and Sorensen's husband, both of whom were swiftly cleared. The investigation has known little progress since. According to subsequent updates, a $25,000 reward has been offered to anyone with information leading to the murderer's capture. Number 5. America Thayer. At around 2:30 p.m. on July the 28th of 2021, police officers in Shakopee, Minnesota, were notified of a stabbing that occurred in the middle of an intersection in a suburban neighborhood. When the authorities arrived at the scene, they discovered a human head and the headless body it was previously attached to lying on the road. The victim was identified as America Thayer, a 55-year-old Shakopee resident. She had been decapitated by a machete, which the police found discarded in a nearby recycling bin alongside a pile of bloody clothing. It wasn't long before investigators named the prime suspect in Thayer's brutal murder, Alexis Saborit, age 42. Saborit had been in a relationship with Thayer for 7 years prior to the killing, and he was positively identified by multiple eyewitnesses. They found him wandering near the highway roughly 2 miles from the scene of the crime, and he was apprehended without further incident. In conversations with police, Saborit admitted to beheading Thayer after the woman expressed her intention to break up with him. Domestic violence had been an ongoing problem in the couple's contentious relationship, and Saborit had even been issued a restraining order in 2017 before Thayer requested it be removed. On the day of the murder, Saborit was scheduled to appear in court on arson charges after he set fire to his own home. On August 9th of 2021, he was officially charged with second-degree murder for killing his girlfriend. Number 4. Lois Rice. After shooting and killing her own husband, Lois Rice, a grandmother from Blooming Prairie, Minnesota, fled to Florida, where she murdered yet another victim in order to steal her identity. Rice, who was 56 at the time, had gotten into an argument with her husband, David, on March the 11th of 2018. According to Rice's testimony to police, he had given her a loaded gun and told her to take her own life. Rice instead turned the weapon on him, firing multiple rounds into his chest. Upon realizing he was dead, she withdrew $10,000 from his bank account and went on the run. First, she escaped to Fort Myers Beach, Florida, and began searching for a woman who looked enough like her that she could steal their identity. She decided on 59-year-old Pamela Hutchinson, whom she then befriended. On April the 6th, however, Florida police discovered Hutchinson's dead body inside a Fort Myers Beach hotel. The same gun that had taken David Rice's life had been used on Hutchinson as well. A nationwide hunt for Lois Rice began. She was eventually tracked down by U.S. Marshals, who found her in a restaurant in South Padre Island, Texas, on April the 19th. She was given a life sentence in Florida for murdering Hutchinson. In July of 2020, she was extradited back to Minnesota, where she stood trial for the murder of her husband. She apologized to her husband's family and friends as she admitted to killing him. She subsequently received a second life sentence. She will live out the remainder of her years behind bars in Minnesota. Number 3. Terry Brisk. 41-year-old Terry Brisk of Little Falls, Minnesota, was expected to go into work on November the 7th of 2016, but instead, he was found dead on his parents' property. His parents were unaware that he'd taken the day off to go hunting on their land, until they spotted his car parked outside. They decided not to disturb him, but when he failed to return from the wooded section of the property that they commonly use for hunting, the family set out to look for him. They were then met with a harrowing sight as Brisk had been shot dead while on his hunt, and his rifle was missing from the scene, though investigators initially speculated that Brisk might have taken his own life. The missing rifle seemed to indicate that someone else had carried out the shooting and then fled with the murder weapon. The autopsy confirmed that another party was involved, and the coroner ruled his death a homicide. Despite this discovery, the police struggled to identify any suspects in Brisk's murder. In May of 2021, having made no further progress in the case, the Morrison County Sheriff's Office brought in an outside investigator to aid them in their efforts to bring justice to Brisk's mystery killer. There was a 13-foot memorial stone placed near the area where his body was found on his parents' land. The victim was survived by a wife and 4 children. Number 2. Justine Damond. 40-year-old Justine Damond's attempts to call on the Minneapolis Police Department for help would trigger a chain of events that led to her own demise. In the late hours of July the 15th of 2017, Damond placed 2 calls to 911. She reported what she believed to be a woman getting assaulted in an alley behind her house. The emergency dispatchers categorized the call as a low-priority tip, potentially because Damond was calling from the relatively low-crime neighborhood of Fulton. Eventually, 2 officers were dispatched to the scene. They were 31-year-old Mohammed Noor and his partner, Matthew Harity, aged 25. Noor was well known within the Minneapolis community for being one of the city's first Somali-American officers. The 2 policemen drove their squad car with its lights turned off down the alley Damond had described to the 911 operator. Upon arriving at the scene of the reported crime, they found nothing to suggest that there had been an attack. At that point, Noor documented in the police car's computer that the scene had been cleared, and the 2 officers prepared to leave. Suddenly, the pair were startled by a loud noise coming from outside their vehicle. At that very moment, a barefoot Damond approached the squad car from the driver's side, further alarming the officers. They both drew their weapons, and Harity kept his gun lowered, but Noor fired a single shot through the window, striking Damond in the midsection. The officers subsequently attempted CPR on the woman, who was unconscious, but she passed away within minutes. Though Noor insisted in the ensuing criminal trial that he was simply acting in self-defense when he shot Damond, he was ultimately convicted of 3rd-degree murder and 2nd-degree manslaughter. In June of 2019, he successfully appealed the 3rd-degree murder charge in the Minnesota Supreme Court on September the 15th of 2021. His initial prison sentence was 12.5 years, but following his appeal, Noor was scheduled to be resentenced for the lesser manslaughter charge alone. Number 1. The Byron David Smith murders. Byron David Smith, aged 64, brutally killed 2 individuals attempting to burglarize his home in Little Falls, Minnesota. He had retired from a position at the U.S. State Department and lived alone at the time of the incident, which took place on Thanksgiving Day 2012. Smith's residence had been targeted multiple times in the months leading up to the incident, and he had consequently installed a security system in his house to catch the culprits. He also began regularly walking around his home with a loaded gun strapped to his waist. On the day of the killings, Smith had driven his car to a neighbor's home to give the burglars the impression that his house was empty. It wasn't long before 18-year-old Hailey Kiefer and her cousin Nicholas Brady, age 17, broke into Smith's house with the intention of robbing it. Unbeknownst to them, they were walking into a trap that Smith had laid out for them. He was also inside the home, positioned in a dark corner with his firearm in hand. Smith then turned on a recording device to capture the events that followed. After lying in wait for 12 minutes, he fired 2 shots at Brady as he went down into the basement. The teen fell to the bottom of the stairs, and as he lay wounded on the floor, Smith stood above his body and taunted him. He then fired an additional shot to Brady's head, killing him. Kiefer came looking for her cousin in the basement and was also shot by Smith while climbing down the stairs. She attempted to escape, but Smith shot her multiple times in the torso and the left side of her face, all the while gleefully insulting her. He then delivered the kill shot by discharging his gun into Kiefer's chin. The burglar's dead body sat in Smith's basement for an entire day before he called the police, an aspect he'd later tried to justify by claiming he didn't want to bother anyone on Thanksgiving. He was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. In court, Smith argued that his actions were justified under the Castle Doctrine, which allows homeowners to use lethal force in defense of their residents. The jury was not swayed, however, and he was sentenced to life in prison, with the recording captured by his own device playing a significant role in his conviction. Thanks for watching. Be sure to click on one of the links on your screen for more videos.